How's it going, everybody? This is Cameron White with White Light Astrology. Welcome back to your favorite weekly horoscope. What the fuck is going on in the universe for June 24th through July 1st of 2019. Thank you guys so much for being here and liking and sharing and commenting and subscribing. I love and appreciate every single one of you guys. This week, we don't have too much going on. We are going to have Mercury ingress into Leo before it stations retrograde next week as well. Well, that's really it. By the time we get into next Monday, that's when we're going to have Mars ingress into Leo, and then we're going to start the solar eclipse in Cancer, starting eclipse season, and I talk all about that in my monthly horoscopes, which I'm posting tomorrow. I know, I've been lagging on it, but I'm posting my monthly horoscopes tomorrow so you could hear all about the eclipse stuff and what's going on for you guys. However, besides, the Mercury ingress into Leo, that's really it. And what I think is important about this week is even though there's not a whole lot of planetary action going on, next week there is. We have Mars ingressing into Leo, we have Venus ingressing into Cancer, we have Mercury stationing retrograde, and we have eclipse season starting. That's a lot of stuff. And I think this week is kind of giving us a nice time and space to kind of get comfortable with what's going to happen next. Kind of it's like planning and prepping. You can't always plan and prep when you got a million things going on. This week, things kind of died down a little bit so we can focus on what we're going to be getting into when we get into July. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the horoscope. So starting this week off, we're just going to be having the moon in Pisces on Monday on June 24th. And that's really it. And I think what's going to be cool about the moon being in Pisces is it is going to apply to a trine to Mars and Mercury, as in they're in the last couple degrees of Cancer. And while the moon's in Pisces, and Pisces is all about, not having boundaries, being expansive, being open, it's kind of I like using Pisces as mist. It can or water is a good way to put it. It can be a solid, a liquid, or a gas. It kind of just depends on its mood. And while the moon is in Pisces, I think this is kind of getting a start to our week by kind of not having to focus on things so much strictly, but being a little bit more open to how it can look and how we can feel. But as the moon is in Pisces, I think this is just a good time to really be open about what things are supposed to look like, especially as it's trining Mercury and it's trining Mars. This is giving us a little bit more influence of what the Mercury retrograde is going to look like and how we can better align our actions with our emotions. But then on Tuesday, on June 25th, that is when we're going to have the moon ingress into Aries, and then later on it will start to make a trine to Jupiter, or at least start applying to a trine to Jupiter. And I think while the moon goes into Aries, that switch from moon into Pisces is kind of what's going on right now? And then to Aries, it's go time, we got to focus, we got to do stuff. While the moon goes into Aries and is very focused on what can we attain, what can we defend, what can we say, what can we do, it is going to start trining Jupiter, or at least applying to a trine to Jupiter. And I think this is really about going, what's going to be the best, as far as this moment goes, where do I need to direct myself and direct my energy and my thoughts and my emotions that are best going to serve me in a, not in the long run type sense, but more in a philosophical sense. What mindset and how are you applying your emotions mindfully that are actually going to help you progress is a good way to put it. But that's all that's going on Tuesday. However, as we get into Wednesday on June 26th, that is when we're going to have the moon start to square Mars and Mercury, and it's going to start to square Saturn. And so it leaves a trine with Jupiter, which is really positive, but then immediately goes into a square with Saturn, and then immediately goes into a square with Mercury and Mars. And this is where we get a little bit of conflict, because while the moon is in Aries, it is in its fall, it's kind of can be a little bit hard-headed, it can be easy to get angry or frustrated at things. But while the moon is right in between Saturn and Mars and Mercury, I think this is about going, what's my next decision and what's my next action? While the moon is squaring Saturn, this is kind of bringing a limiting feeling to what our powers or what we can actually be capable of doing. But while the moon is applying to Mars and Mercury, I think this is about going, even though I feel the restrictions of what I can and can't do, it's about having not necessarily mind over matter, but you're still going to feel like you got to force the situation anyway. While the moon is in Aries and it's squaring Mars and Cancer, there's this weird mutual reception where, if you've got the right jive, if you've got the right vibe, you can apply yourself, you can do whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, but you're not going to be able to do that without getting frustrations along the way. But then as we jump into Thursday on June 27th, that is when we're going to have the moon enter Taurus and Mercury is going to enter Leo. So while the moon enters Taurus, I think this is about getting us a little bit more grounded and a little bit more solid in our foundation. Yeah, the moon will be conjoining Uranus during its transit right there, which is, we kind of have to get comfortable in a new situation. I mean, I talked a lot about that when we were talking about Uranus ingressing into Taurus. However, on Thursday, we also have Mercury ingressing into Leo. And Mercury's going to station retrograde in Leo, but I think there's going to be a big vibe shift from Mercury in Cancer being very thoughtful and trying to apply logic and reason to like emotional factors that are kind of hard to apply logic and reason to sometimes. But while Mercury goes into Leo, I think this is about thinking, placing a mindset on, and communicating in a better way that's more expressive, more visual, more integral, more part of, what's a good way to put it? While Mercury's going through Leo, or while Mercury enters Leo, I think this is just going to be a good time to not be afraid to be expressive, but looking at ourselves and looking at how, not necessarily how we're expressing, not meaning, the who, what, when, where, and why, but the vibe, the energy of why we're expressing and what we're doing. I think this is going to become a lot more louder, a lot greater. But I want to hit on the fact that while Mercury's going to station retrograde here pretty soon, don't exactly act out of that impulsively. Like, Mercury and Leo can be easy to be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to say this. And like, I have a Mercury and Leo. I'll say whatever the fuck I want when I want. And it's so bad. But don't do that. Like, this is the time to go, what needs to be said, what needs to be addressed. And if you got to say it, say it loudly so the whole world can hear it. But Mercury is going to station retrograde, so there are going to be some problems right here. So my biggest, advice is pay attention to what's going on, what you're saying, what you're thinking, what you're doing. And don't, give yourself 3 seconds of thought before you actually speak. And then by the time we get into Friday on June 28th, that is when the moon's going to start applying to a trine to Saturn. This is going to be pretty nice because while there's the Saturn situation is looking gunky and ugly, along with Mars and Mercury leaving in opposition to it. However, as the moon starts to trine Saturn, I wanted to hit on, like I just did a couple seconds ago, about how the moon in Taurus is going to give us a little bit better feeling of groundedness, support, foundation. I think as the moon starts to make that trine to Saturn, we're starting to get a little bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable and finding more, protection, stability, and security within a area that we're not used to having stability and security in. But then by the time we get into this weekend on Saturday and Sunday, on Saturday we're going to be having the moon enter Gemini, and that's when it's going to be sextiling Mercury and Mars. And while the moon goes into Gemini, the moon in Gemini is always kind of like, let's think our thoughts out loud and say it all out loud and talk to ourselves time. Like, that's like what's the word I'm looking for? Like the stereotypical, moon in Gemini delineation. But the moon in Gemini is kind of like, let's be a little bit more open about our ideas. Let's be a little bit more open about how we're expressing and how we're communicating. And while the moon is in Gemini, it's kind of like feeling out our thoughts, if that makes sense. Rather than like thinking about our feelings, this is like feeling out our thoughts. But as the moon starts to sextile Mercury and Mars, I think this is also bringing a little bit more progressive energy to Mercury and Mars. Now, Mercury's in Leo, it can be a little bit more loud and proud. Mars is still in Cancer, and it still needs a little bit support, so I think that moon in Gemini is going to help that a little bit, especially coming off from that moon in Aries that we had starting this week off, and it was squaring Mars and Mercury, which was kind of rough. This is kind of like giving a helping hand to Mercury and Mars versus kind of like telling Mercury and Mars what to do. And then on Sunday, on June, 29th, we have the moon opposing Jupiter and squaring Neptune. And this is kind of tricky because while Jupiter and Neptune are squaring each other right now, Neptune's now retrograde, Jupiter's still retrograde, the moon being opposite Jupiter is kind of like, Jupiter and Sagittarius can have us feeling very philosophical, very expansive in, whatever direction we want to go or grow into or what the possibilities are. And while that's squaring Neptune, we're trying to decide of what can actually be plausibly real and what is just not real anymore, and where do we have to kind of figure out what the truth is and what it's not. As the moon opposes Gemini, this is kind of, not moon opposes Gemini, while the moon is in Gemini and it's opposing Jupiter, this is kind of like looking at those big dreams and that idealism that Jupiter holds, and is kind of looking at it and going, how can I logically and reasonably, feel this out and make it make sense for me and start to apply it in my day-to-day world. While the moon is squaring Neptune, it's going to be easy to kind of get lost in the illusionary part of it, the confusing side of it. But on Sunday, I think this is about going, what is this long-term vision that you're wanting to create with Jupiter and Sagittarius? And what does that mean for you right now as far as what do you need to feel, what do you need to think, and what do you need to apply in order to attain that goal? And it's not so much always attaining that goal too. I think it's about Jupiter and Sagittarius is about the meaning of vision, the meaning of a destination, of a journey, I should say. Like, What is the meaning and the purpose behind that? Because you know that saying, it's not the journey is the destination in a sense. And while the moon's in Gemini opposing Jupiter, it's kind of like figuring that out and starting to understand that in a very literal way. But then by the time we get into next week on Monday, on July 1st, that is when we're going to have the moon conjoin Venus at like the last degrees of Gemini. This is the moon kind of going, you know what, there are more possibilities. I know where to put my hands into, like I'm not just isolated and alone. Venus and Gemini is saying like there are other people out there that are doing this stuff too. You're not alone in this. It's just about finding them or being more social or just connecting yourself more to the things that you actually like and that are going to help you in the long run get to where you want to go. But also on Monday, we have Mars entering Leo. And with Mars going into Leo, this is kind of like our shift in attitude from kind of like trying to act out on our emotions and being a little bit, back and forth on how we feel about things and what we want to do. Mars in Leo is like, this is what I want to do. This is what's right for me. I'm feeling very prideful about this. And this is what being in integrity looks like. While Mars is in Leo, though, this is also going to be an easy time to get kind of frustrated. And it's like it's Mars in a fire sign. If you're going to be mad, it's going to be loud. And while Mars does go into Leo, I think this is just about looking at if we're going to take action, it better be for the right reasons. Because while Mars was in Cancer, it was like, man, we needed to do all this stuff, but there just wasn't the energy to do it or the exact decision-making. We didn't have the exact decision-making skills to be like, yes, this is what we got to do and I got to do it. Mars in Cancer is like, I don't have the energy for this. I'm not sure if this is what I want. I'm cranky. I'm moody. Mars going into Leo is like, if you're going to take action, make sure it's for something serious or make sure it's for something that actually matters. But then also on Monday, we have the moon going into Cancer. And even though we won't have the solar eclipse until next week on the 2nd, this is starting to get things started in a sense. And then we go into eclipse season. Eclipse season is always the weirdest 2 weeks of a 6-month period because it happens twice a year. However, it's going to get weird next week. And we have a lot to talk about next week because next week we have the solar eclipse in Cancer. We have Saturn conjoining the South Node like the whole week. And we have Venus ingressing into Cancer. And we have Mercury stationing retrograde. A lot is happening next week. And this week I want to just hit on again, like, while the moon is going through Pisces, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, make some decisions, get yourself grounded, but be open about what the possibilities can look like. Because as we go into next week, things are going to be switching, things are going to be happening, and things are going to start to make more things are going to start getting piled on to where they start making more sense. It's like when you're watching one of your favorite TV shows and they're building up towards the climax, and then right before the climax, or when you think the climax is going to be, they put in all this new information that you thought maybe you knew, but they didn't really tell you about. They give you all this information, then you're like, whoa, this means something completely different. That's what this week going into next week looks like. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for being here and liking and sharing and commenting and subscribing. I love and appreciate every single one of you guys, and I'll be seeing you next week.